Welcome back to Reality Cool Show. Today I'm interviewing Reactionary Jew, and we're going to be talking about all of this controversial JQ stuff. I'm going to be asking a few questions that people sent in from Twitter and just generally chatting. I'll just start by saying that I actually, it's like certainly not a topic that I'm a specialist in for JQ. It's not even something that I find particularly compelling or interesting, actually. But it is obviously an important topic in the alt-right, so that's why a lot of people often ask me to discuss it. And what better than to have an actual Jew on to talk about it? Hey.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks for offering. And someone sent this question in, and I thought it was quite a good place to start, actually, which is, what is your definition of a JQ?
Before with that question, can I just give a little it's not really a disclaimer, but it's something that it comes up every time I get interviewed or every time I write an article or
Mm-hmm.
uh, for me, if I talk about white issues specifically, if I talk about the West, if I talk about mass immigration, etc., I'm accused of sort of hiding the Jew stuff. But if I talk about the Jew stuff, then I'm accused of injecting my issues into the alt-right. I just want to be clear that I don't really consider myself a part of the alt-right. It would be very strange if I would,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm not white. It's not my nationalism. It's a different people. I'm sympathetic to it, certainly, but I am an outsider looking in. I want that to be clear so that people don't, this it comes up every time, I guarantee you. So that's why I just want to get it out of the way first. Anyway, would you repeat your
Yeah.
question, please?
But actually, yeah, I was going to say, like, because a lot of people get very sensitive about this topic, don't they? And they also get fairly conspiratorial about this kind of thing and start imagining all sorts of motives and everything. So let's just be honest. I don't know you. I don't know what your motives are. And I can't promise the listeners anything. You're just going to have to listen and take it as it is, and make up your own minds. We're not trying to push any kind of agenda here. We're just having a discussion. You can listen to it. You can make up your own mind. You can do your own thinking. You can certainly comment below and tell us what you think. So yeah, the first question is actually just a discussion of what the JQ is, because obviously not everyone who's listening is really aware of what the JQ is or has ever heard of it.
Sure. So I think first it's important to recognize that Jews as a group they have a distinct identity when they live not just in white societies, but in any society. Although I think in the context that we're talking about, we're going to be talking primarily about the interaction with host societies that are white. And then realizing that there are certain dynamics, there are certain recurring patterns. People argue about the causes, about like the details, but there is definitely something huge going on here. The interaction between Jews and their host countries. And some people think this is fairly innocuous. Some people think this is like the main issue out of which everything else flows. I don't think there's a need to have that binary about it, but there is definitely a question of what is the role of Jewish influence in Gentile white societies? How has that affected history? And also, what do we take away from that? What are the implications for the course of action that we should implement?
Mm-hmm.
That's a very broad idea of it. Of course, I'm sure we're going to get into the details, plenty of them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people who, aren't necessarily familiar with this idea are asking, like, why is there a question in the first place? I mean, why would people feel a need to question this in the first place? What do you think?
Well, if you look at the history of Europe, for example, so Europeans within themselves, they had their borders shifted many times over the years. They fought bloody wars with each other. Sometimes you even had Europeans colonizing other Europeans, like in the case of Ireland. But with the Jews, it's a little different. With the Jews, they live as this sort of minority class in host nations. Sometimes, very often, they were ghettoized to the point where they had no political rights or social mobility. But when they are given social mobility and political rights, they tend to rise almost invariably to the very top of society in terms of wealth, in terms of influence. And then what almost always happens, and people of course disagree about the reasons, is they either end up getting killed or persecuted or kicked out of those nations. You can look at a map of Europe that shows all the different expulsions of Jews over the more than 1,000 years of history that our people have together. And it's just expulsion after expulsion after expulsion. And you start to wonder, this is not normal. This is something, begs for an explanation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is a pretty unique situation. I can't think of any group of people that happens to anywhere else in the world, you know?
I can't either. I mean, there are definitely persecuted minorities, but it's not the same as Jews in Europe. That is a sort of unique situation. I just want to be clear that I use this word persecuted over and over. People are going to say, "Oh, he's playing the victim card." I'm like, we are going to talk about causes, but we're just talking about a description of what happened. And we'll get to the details.
Okay. And I mean, that leads on perhaps to the next big question, I suppose, which is, what is your stance on Zionism?
Well, I think Zionism is the future of the Jewish people. I think that I'm very anti-diaspora.
Sorry, I'm actually not particularly familiar with this. And what does anti-diaspora mean?
The diaspora it's a generic word that refers to a nation living in other people's countries. So
okay.
Yeah, like there's an African American, it's an African diaspora in the Americas, you could call that.
Oh, okay. New word for me. Thank you.
Yeah. So the Jewish diaspora is the Jewish nation dispersed throughout Europe, throughout parts of the East. That's almost not a thing anymore. But America is the largest diaspora today. Out of the bulk of the population, the majority, the biggest Jewish population is in Israel. But outside of that, you have the U.S. And I'll just dig right into it, which is this is me going to be bashing my own people a little bit. If you look at many of the problems that the West is facing, like mass immigration, you look at certain degenerate behavior. One thing that you just have to acknowledge is that Jews are disproportionately behind so many of these things. One of the memes that's been going around is the every single time meme. Like every time you see someone saying fellow white people and then embrace some leftist, we have to look out, we have to be careful about the way we treat black people, or every time you see some new thing that didn't exist in society 30 years ago, and you look for who is behind this in academia and who really pushed this. This is something, it's always a Jew. It's almost always, and if it's not a Jew, there's if there are non-Jews involved, there are probably also Jews involved.
Right, which is unusual, right? Because of course in the US, Jews make up about 2% of the population, but they are highly disproportionately in positions of influence, such as in the media, such as in the education system, and where else? Like you see a lot of journalists, again, that's media, but and you'll often, like you said, you'll often see them making these kind of announcements like, fellow white people, like we must embrace diversity and work harder to embrace diversity and things like this. And then like their next tweet will be, by the way, I'm a Holocaust survivor, etc. And it doesn't. So it's okay. So you kind of switch your identity based on who you're appealing to, and I guess that's one of the aspects that people get a bit disgruntled about.
There's something much deeper going on there. But before that, I just want to say this is something that I noticed, and I said this in the Red Ice interview as well. This is something I've noticed since I was very young, and I can't tell you the exact age, but even as early as preteen, I noticed, because I was raised quite conservatively personally. I was raised, my parents were always red-pilled. They didn't use the language of the alt-right. They didn't start talking about Evola and how we have to take down liberal democracy or race and IQ, but they had a very implicit understanding of these things and a very healthy understanding of these things. And there was my father was a veteran, for example, in the Israeli army. on the front lines. And when you are in that sort of, let's say, national conflict, you can't walk away with it with like this understanding of the world as everyone is the same, and it's you learn that it's all nonsense very quickly, because
Right.
reality is the greatest red pill.
Yes,
But
traveling especially, yeah.
yeah, uh, but you said it's a matter of, they have different hats of identity, and they sort of they put on different ones. There's some of the things that they attribute a very deliberate aspect of agency to Jews, and this is something that I'd like to address. First of all, I'd like to lay a foundation for Jewish identity detached from all this JQ stuff, because it's very easy for whites in the US or in Europe to look at this very much as they should from their own perspective, but without having a bigger picture understanding of how Jews see themselves and how Jews view their own history. This is one of the things, for example, that I quite like about Kevin MacDonald. I've chatted with
Hmm.
him quite extensively.
Yeah.
I do think that he has a very nuanced approach. I don't agree with him on everything, but he does try to be objective. He is not insane or conspiratorial, and he
Always
he
nice.
tries yeah, and he tries to understand Jews, from their own perspective very often. And even there, I think I would disagree with him, but it's not because he's acting in bad faith, in my opinion.
Right.
So the history of the Jews, if you're religious like me, you believe that we're a people who were taken out of Egypt as slaves by God. We conquered the land of Israel, which the seven tribes of Canaan inhabited at the time. And there's much more history, but let's just skip, now to the first and second temple era. You can read plenty of that, on your own time, but we're not going to go through all of Jewish history here. The second temple era, the Romans sacked Jerusalem because Israel is on the Mediterranean basin, and that was part of the Roman Empire. And the Jews after that were dispersed throughout the nations. People talk about the Holocaust like it's the greatest tragedy in Jewish history, but I don't think anything actually rivals the destruction of the Second Temple. It wasn't just the destruction of the building, it was the uprooting of the Jews from their land and being turned into a diaspora people. This fear that Europeans have of living as a minority in other nations, so many of these leftists, they gaslight them and they say, that's insane. You're always going to be in control of your countries. And of course, they always have said that, and they've gotten more and more callous as time goes along. But this, no one wants to live that way, and we should
Yeah.
know because we have lived that way. It
Right.
sucks to be a minority, always like at the mercy of a host nation. No one wants to be in that situation.
Hmm.
So I completely sympathize, for example, with wanting to actually keep your countries. I get that, but this is the beginning of the Jewish diaspora as we know it. Some Jews were scattered eastward, some Jews were scattered to Europe, and the diaspora outside of Europe, sometimes it's romanticized. It's because there's this narrative of the cruel white man and the Arabs. They got along very well with the Jews. I mean, it's not as clear cut as people make it seem. There was a lot of problems with Arabs too, but overall, it was much worse with Europe. The history there is much more bloody. Things recurred much more often. There are longer periods of peaceful coexistence with Jews in Arab lands, and I think part of that is because,
Interesting, considering
yeah,
how much Muslims really hate Jews. I mean, kind of weird, hey?
yeah, but that's actually there's you can attribute that almost not totally directly, but in very large part you can attribute that to Zionism. We'll get to that soon. I know there's just so many things here.
Hmm.
Uh, when it comes to the European diaspora now, you end up with this situation. For a long time, I don't think the JQ was really in its current form. For a long time, it was much more religious in nature. It was the Jews are Christ killers.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
but once Jews began to dominate the financial spheres in Europe, first in Italy, then in Eastern Europe, people became very resentful towards them. And a lot of times you end up with this situation where Jews are still stuck in that mentality of, we have to be careful, or we have to, people are going to resent us and see
Hmm.
us as the subversive element. I think there were many times in European history, and maybe the finance is not the best example of that like none of this is uniform. That's one of the big problems when you're speaking about this history. There were times when uh, Jews, let's say, really just like they didn't know what they did, but then there were other times when, like, I'll get to the example later. Weimar Germany, if we're just going to be honest, like that was a time when you can look at Jewish influence before whatever happened, and you can say, okay, there's a lot of stuff going on that we really don't like, and very often it all gets melded together. So there's this concept in leftist versions of anti-Semitism, or even mainstream versions, that where Europeans scapegoat Jews when things go to hell. The Jews are the ones in the positions of influence, and they're going to receive the brunt of the blame because it's an easy other to attribute your problems to. I think that narrative is kind of oversimplified. It certainly is true, and I see this today with extremely oversimplified thinking about the JQ, where people say, we don't even have any problems. All these issues like feminism, Islam, go down the list. It's all just a symptom of the Jewish problem. I've seen that kind of thinking. Like Europe would be great. It would be perfect. It's just those Jews ruin everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a very ahistorical and totally oversimplified version of the question. But I don't think I've lost friends for saying this. I've lost even for giving mild versions of this. There are times when if I saw what was going on, maybe at certain times, or if I see what's going on now, because I actually do live in the U.S. and I do see what's going on now, it's very hard for me to look and say, okay, I don't understand how anyone could hate us. I think that there is going to be there is so much ammunition to be used here, because it's true. A lot of it is true. But once people get angry, for example, when we're talking about how it really plays out, it doesn't, like, all the nuance will go out the window. Which ultimately, I don't think, and I'm not saying this to blame Europeans or depict them as uniquely evil. I think that for our sake, we should be clear that we're never really safe in host white countries. It's just a cycle. But the thing is, for many Jews, their understanding of history is that they think we can educate people against anti-Semitism. And they don't understand the JQ. They don't understand let's say, the involvement in mass immigration or the involvement in the LGBT.
Do you think that this is part of the reason they feel so strongly about diversity, and that they often are pushing diversity? Like, if this happens a lot on social media, you'll get some person, you post something slightly not politically correct, and then some person really starts hammering away, trying to debunk what you've written and everything, and then it's oh, it's a Jew, huh? And it's maybe because they feel like they are being attacked, if you point out the downsides of diversity in Western countries, they take that kind of well, you're also attacking my standing here.
Yeah. So this is something that's very deep, and I think many of them don't even understand this part of their psyche, which is they, deep down, they know that they're an other. Some of them really think that we can embrace the civic identity that includes everyone. And in Christian ethnic Europe, I have an article up about this, which says that in Christian ethnic Europe, it was obvious, Jews were a separate ethnic group. There was not even a question that they were an other, and that was something very apparent. Some of them in some parts of European history did want to be considered, let's say, German or French or whatever host country they were in, but there was still a very obvious conception of them as an other. America and Canada and Australia are different, but of course primarily America, because we have a much longer and bigger history and diaspora there. America is different because there's all these concepts that Sam Dixon talks about that were written into the beginning of the country that aren't really true or particularly grounded in reality. All men are created equal, and everyone has these inalienable rights. And that's a lot of Jews, even conservative Jews, really like to emphasize that aspect of America, because they can't be othered under this universalist civic conception. Mm-hmm. Now, with many conservative Jews, they don't really feel this pressing need to have diversity, or because I'll get to why that is soon. But for a lot of leftist Jews that are uprooted from their traditions, that don't really have a proper conception, and this I actually want to get on this tangent because it's important. There is a very strong traditional Jewish identity that goes beyond the politics, that goes beyond, let's say, the activism that you see in the West. We have, if you believe as I do, we are we have been given a set of laws. We've been given a divine purpose by God, and that it's incumbent upon us to actually fulfill and follow all those things and maintain the continuity of our communities and nation in accordance with those principles. If you don't have those, and Jews I think of any ethnic group in America are the most atheistic. I don't quote me on that necessarily. It's definitely up there. If it's not the most, we are definitely up there. So many Jews, even if they're not atheists, many of them are Reform Jews, which was a movement that started in a sort of assimilationist movement that started in Germany in the last 200 years, not even that long ago, where a lot of these principles are discarded for some sort of liberal humanism. Often they were discarded in Eastern Europe for communism, sometimes for secular Zionism. Jewish identity is something that's extremely powerful, and the traditional religion is in my opinion, a proper manifestation for that, and it gives you all the directives for how to channel that properly. If that's not channeled properly, I think it's not a coincidence that it's led to some of the most destructive ideologies and ideas in the history of the West. You can look at so many different ones. You have communism on the one hand, and then just the whole family tree of Marxism, which includes feminism, critical race theory, etc. So many, but the pioneering intellectuals behind that were Jews. I think a big reason for that is because they don't have a healthy relationship with their own identity. So it ends up having to manifest itself in politics. As an example, you have the diversity thing. We're going to get back to this now. I had to go on that little tangent because I felt that it was important. But part of this is this burning need. They don't even understand how fundamental it is to them, specifically because it's a vicarious substitute for an identity that they're not in touch with in a healthy way, which is, anyone can be an American, whatever the hell that means. What does it mean to be an American?
Yeah.
And that's why. And it's not enough, by the way, for them to just have that conception on paper or on the Constitution. If it doesn't apply to Muslims, if it doesn't apply to like Indians, if it doesn't apply to every ethnic immigrant group that you can possibly apply to, that's dangerous in their mind, because that is a statement of the particular identity of that society. Even these sort of tacit, these implicit identities like Christianity in the public square, or some even vague appeal to Greco-Roman ideals, that sometimes scares these Jews, because it's the assertion of the host society's particularism, and that makes them feel excluded. And any exclusion, if it goes far enough in their mind, will lead to some great tragedy.
Yes. Sorry, I just wanted to interrupt and say, perhaps it's almost like if we can't have our own country, then we'll have no countries. It's a very extreme kind of thing. It's like either you, well, I guess it's the case anyway, like either you have nations or you have open borders, and that's pretty much what we're struggling with at the moment. I mean, which way would you say most Jews are kind of pushing for?
So the majority of Jews in the U.S., and it's specifically the ones in the U.S. that matter in this context, the majority of Jews in the U.S. are pretty liberal. They voted, I think, 70 or 80% for Hillary Clinton. It's at least 70. It might be 80, but I don't know the exact number. The point is, it's an overwhelming majority. It's a very significant one, and most Jews tend to exist in these sort of liberal enclaves, like New York, for example, or Chicago, or something like that, where I think they feel more comfortable in diversity, and they don't even know why sometimes. Because they don't. It's a certain lack of appreciation for their identity, and it has to be melded into the melting pot, because otherwise it doesn't. It's harder to contextualize for them. And you see, for example, Orthodox Jews, which is the demographic I belong to, which in themselves are not at all homogenous. They're actually there's quite a bit of ideological diversity within Orthodoxy. Like they say, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. It's more like 10 Jews, 50 opinions. But the Orthodox world itself, you saw overwhelmingly voted for Trump. That doesn't mean they're red pilled. It doesn't mean they're fascists. It means that these appeals to multiculturalism and racism that are very popular with liberal diaspora Jews don't really work. They don't have that mental PC grip on Orthodox Jews as a whole. Now leftism has been seeping into Orthodoxy, which is one of the more unfortunate developments, but it's still within Orthodoxy, it's still a fringe. And if you look at the ultra-Orthodox community, who are the people who are parodied the most in like these memes wearing the traditional Eastern European garb that they still haven't gotten rid of, they're the ones who actually are the least politically active and are very often red pilled by reality because they live in these neighborhoods with blacks and Latino, and they just keep to themselves. The PC has no stranglehold on them. I found that engaging them very often, they're very insular, and when I engage them about some of these topics, they're actually quite easy to red pill because they don't push back at all against any of this. They're like, how could you say that equality? Because they've never been indoctrinated with that in their private schools.
Yeah, it just seems like common sense. I mean, it literally is something like babies are racist. I mean, just, search it in the search engine, you'll see babies are racist, and why is that? Because it's not something that's conditioned. It's actually just an innate ability to recognize patterns. And it's actually a form of intelligence called discrimination, the ability to discriminate between one group and another. And it's not actually a bad thing. It's a tool that can be used in a good way or in a negative way. So I wanted to just actually ask you, what would your ideal situation be? Like, what would you like to see happen?
So ideally, I want the diaspora to end. How that's going to happen? Hopefully peacefully. One of the things is that goes on. One of the dynamics you see in America, especially with these media figures, these pearl-clutching leftists on Twitter and on others, they write these gushy op-eds about how Jews might not feel welcome in American politics, or they might be alienated from America, or they might how could this happen? I've lived in this country for 100 years. I've lived here longer than some of the white immigrants that have lived here. And they first of all, I think this whole focus on amount of time as what really designates a nation, like how many generations your family has lived here, that doesn't mean anything with ethnic minorities all over the world. Like suddenly it's magically different in America. It's ridiculous. What forms a nation is a much stronger sense of identity that goes back way longer than some, we wrote the Constitution, then we applied it to these citizens, so now they're part of our nation. It's never worked that way. But they hear talk from the alt-right of not even implicit appeals to the particular identity of it's just explicit, like this is a white country, it belongs to whites. That scares them because it's like, our ancestors were expelled so many times for this, and we lost so many lives. But they're missing first of all, they haven't learned anything from history, or if they have, they haven't applied that particularly well. And also, for me, I look at whether they like it or not, however it plays out, the diaspora is going to come to an end. It's part of my religious eschatology. The diaspora cannot last. There are, 5 million, 6 million Jews in America. That is going to go. That's not going to last forever. So I look at this I look at the alt-right saying this. They think, oh no, some of them even talk about, like the really hardcore leftists, like we better buy guns and defend ourselves, as if this is like native land or something. They talk about it almost in those terms, or how dare they kick me out of my country. And I'm just thinking, like, this was never our country. This was never some permanent arrangement. This was always made to be temporary. And the story, the trajectory of the Jewish people is one that ends up in Israel. And every stop along the way is just that. It's just a stop along the way. It's not America is not my home. I mean, it's where I live, and it's where I pay taxes and go to school and do all those things. But when you talk about a homeland, like some white guy living in Qatar, is that his home? America is. Some people have made the comparison that America is like not really a homeland in the way Europe was. I don't really agree with that. I think once you've settled the land and become the dominant majority on it, a colony can turn into a home. When you're just living among as a minority among other nations, that's not really your home. It's just not meant to be. Our religion doesn't use that language to describe the diaspora. It's ridiculous kind of thinking. So I'm engaging with the alt-right honestly and saying, yeah, it's not really so bad if one day this diaspora comes to an end, and it's not something to be terrified about. It's actually something that we should welcome and prefer. It's not going to happen that way. It's not like all these leftist Jews are going to get up and say, oh yeah, maybe we should go home, because some of them are really that they feel rooted in America or Europe or wherever they are. But I think that we should begin to prepare for that. We should begin to be honest with ourselves and look at the reality and say, maybe this is the way things should go forward, and it's healthier for people to live in their own nations.
Yeah, I mean, I think I commented, I can't remember if I commented in a video or if it was in person to someone, but I said, like I was watching this video and it was of an Australian Jew, an Israeli Jew, and an American Jew, and they were just meeting up and chatting in Israel. And it was just amazing to watch the rapport, like how well they got on, how well they got each other's sense of humor. It was like they were family, and
They are.
and they were from completely different parts of the world. And I mean, this is the case with all ethnicities, really. And when we try and do multiculturalism, we take that away, we take away that ability to have such amazing connection to like strangers that you meet, So, yeah.
When even as much as I've said, it might seem like I have this disdain for leftist Jews or whatever, and it does bother me. Not even like what bothers me even more on a more personal level is what goes on in Israel, and I'll talk to you about that later. But I actually have very good rapport with them. Like we have Friday night gatherings, and I talk to them, and it's strange. Sometimes I can tell that someone is a Jew, even though I've never met them before, and we would just start talking, and I pick up on it very quickly. I mean, for me, you can tell because I wear a kippah like everywhere I go in school, etc. But I can usually we have a Judar, can pick it up
Yeah,
pretty
right.
well.
Yeah.
It's something. I think it's a very powerful and cohesive identity. It's something, and I'm not saying this to say whites are not some sort of identity. I think they definitely are, without a question. But it's not like it's not that same sort of, you run into another white person. It's not that same sort of very tight-knit ethnocentrism that we have. And you can tell very easily just the way that we were always a diaspora nation. So being cliquish and ethnocentric was almost essential. There was no way to survive without it. Whereas Europeans, I think one of the reasons that they've given their countries away on a silver platter, that they've been as okay with it as they are, because they just take it for granted that they'll
Hmm.
have their countries forever. They're just so
Yeah.
used to being, majorities in their nations, and the concept that might not be the case one day. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, they don't believe it. On a certain level, they can't believe it because it hasn't been part of their reality. Um, but the other thing is, I actually would like to talk about Israel for a bit because it is. A lot of people are going to, oh, you're a neocon, you want some great alliance against Islam, and you're trying to subvert the alt-right. Yeah, okay. Uh, I'll talk about my vision for that country and also geopolitics, because this is something extremely important. One of the big things that's been talked about recently is the influence in foreign policy. And again, this is one of those regions, this is one of those, not regions, this is one of those uh, topics where people focus on a very narrow aspect of it, understandably, but they miss the much bigger picture, I think, because they they're looking at it just from the way that it directly affects them. The war in Iraq, for example, and the war in Syria, which didn't really happen but could have happened. Some of the people pushing for these wars are neoconservative think tanks and they're staffed by people like Bill Kristol, who's the son of Irving Kristol. I can't go down the list of names, but like the influential, prominent neocons of the at the turn of the 21st century were almost all Jews. Many of them, as Kevin MacDonald has pointed out, with direct ties to Israel, with family ties, with think tank ties, and it's you start to wonder. So, like, why do they want these wars? Is it really about spreading democracy? Is it about oil money? Maybe some of them really do believe in this spreading democracy thing, which I think is nonsense for a number of reasons. Maybe some of them, maybe there are interests tied up in the Middle East with the U.S. government. Like, who even knows? Sometimes I look at what the pipelines that are going on there and Russia's interest, the U.S.'s interest. None of that is concrete, but it's clear, and I think it's not evil to point this out, that some of these people have a motive that goes beyond any of that, and it is a sort of terraforming the region, if you will,
Right.
to be more fragmented and to be less
Easier to
cohesive.
divide and conquer,
Yeah.
basically.
Now, the conquer thing is something I'd like to address. There's this greater Israel conspiracy going on, which is there's a verse in the Bible that says that God says to Abraham, "I've given this land to you and your children from the Nile until the Euphrates," not from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, from like the Brook of Egypt to including a big part of Syria and Iraq. And they say these neocons and the government of Israel are all gearing up towards that's just nonsense. I'm sorry. Like they totally overestimate both Israel's military capability, and they also overestimate the extent to which these people are thinking, like how far ahead they are really thinking. But
But
that's
how can you know that? You can't know that for sure.
so I think I can know that for sure.
How?
Because
You can't read their
so
minds. You don't know.
there is a possibility. I'll say this: there is a possibility that certain ones of them are really thinking this far ahead. But the average climate in these think tanks and in these organizations, many of which are open to membership of the public, it's definitely not what the bulk of Jews themselves on the if there are elites planning this out, if there's like the whole hand rubbing, sitting behind it. Like, first of all, I doubt it. But if it is happening, I'm not privy to it. And fine, I guess we can never fully discount the possibility. But I don't think that's the case at all with Greater Israel, with a lot of these other things that people talk about. It's divide, but it's not really conquer. The case of the Golan Heights is the one that's always trotted out, but that was never, for example, under question, I think. That was something that the war in Syria has definitely solidified claim over, but it's not like before this. It was just a rhetorical point used against Israel in international forums. The question that Israel would return the Golan Heights, which it did make a peace offer to Syria at one point to do so, that's something that's just like it's been true for a long time now. And I think that's
Okay.
used to justify much greater conspiracies.
Right. I'm not actually aware of that, so I can't really talk about it very much.
Sure.
But I did want to ask you, I see these kind of like quotes and stuff just like flying by on Twitter and things like that saying that, I mean, you can tell me what you think of this, but saying things like the Goyim are, supposed to be slaves for the Jews, and saying to kill a Goy is to kill is like to kill an animal or something, like it's less than killing an animal or whatever. Oh, you cannot steal from a Goy or a Gentile or whatever. Um, what's your perspective on that?
So first of all, I think a lot of those quotes are out of context. The Talmud is in Aramaic, and it's a compilation of debates, and very often statements in the Talmud, maybe not the specific ones you have mentioned, are given in the context of laying down a premise for an argument. One of the greatest examples that's used is the case of sex with a minor in the Talmud, and people quote that as if it's sanctioning that behavior. But really, it's not. It's simply it's using it within a legalistic debate, and they're just hashing
Right, so
out the
it's like
logic.
one person saying it's okay to do that, and the other person's like, no, it's not, kind of thing. It's
No,
like,
or it can go even further than that, which, if we establish this premise, that it's really like a syllogism game. If we establish this, does this then follow from that? And can we
okay,
make an analogy?
yeah.
That's in the case that I quoted for you. And I think most of the quotes in the Talmud that are like considered super objectionable are usually examples of that. The one that's I would say, like, the Goyim are going to be slaves and all that. First of all, a lot of those ones are mistranslated. I've seen ones that I went to the original text and they're just like it's just plainly not what it says. One thing that is true is that the same rules do not apply. For example, Jews have more laws, and many of the prohibitions on things like interest, for example, are you are allowed to charge interest to a non-Jew, whereas you're not allowed to charge interest to a Jew. Yes, if someone has a problem with that, I don't know what to tell them. Like, but the other thing
So
is,
you can't get a bank loan, or like how does that work
so
practically?
there's a very big loophole that's used. Like, it's in Israel, all the bankers and all the clients, almost all of them are Jews. So they found a way to get around it. But it's not simple on its face. The quotes, also some quotes that I'll give you an example. Let's say for a second that really these quotes are true, right? It says you can enslave them and they're subhuman. Let's say it is true for a second. The people who really believe that are actually the ones who are the least involved in politics. They're the ones who are the most insular and live in their own communities and have very little interaction with the outside world. This word Jewish supremacy is a big canard, I think, because the real Jewish supremacists, like you have this, there's this clip going around of these two Israeli Jews, and I think they gave they really said, like, the Goyim exist to serve us or something like that when they were questioned about it. These are people who sit like learning all day. They probably don't even go to work or get involved in politics, and they are used as an example of what these secular and leftist Jews are doing in America or in think tanks, etc. It's like these people often don't believe in the Talmud. They look at it as a historical, just a cultural result of the Jews getting together and doing things, and like their religious texts, but it's not anything divine. It doesn't have any real significance to it. They scorn Berdichevsky, for example, was a Jewish poet, and he said, the Talmud, it would be better if we never really discovered it because it was all just a big waste of time that wasn't built on Enlightenment principles. And it's
Okay.
this sort of disdain for religious traditional Judaism is not uncommon among leftist and liberal Jews.
Right. Okay. So just to clarify what you're saying, like you're saying that it's maybe some of the like kind of, I guess, like fundamentalist kind of very religious Jews might say things like that, but it's actually the ones that are in power tend to be the actual more like atheistic Jews. Is that right?
Yeah, atheist, liberal, cosmopolitan Jews. Yeah, definitely. There's a huge difference between them. I actually like to get to Israeli politics and what that difference means within there soon.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Interesting.
people project, for example, there are liberal neocons with double standards, absolutely, like immigration for the West and closed borders for Israel. But also, we want a two-state solution, and it's evil to take away minority rights. So they still are somewhat married to this idea of liberal democracy. But then they take the ruthless fundamentalist traditionalist and they combine it with like the communist and the liberal neocon and like the generic socially conservative limited government type who's working in National Review, and they put all of it together. It's like the Jew is all of these things, and it just they have a hard time sometimes with nuance. But it is important to understand these divisions within the Jewish community. And I'm not saying Orthodoxy is perfect. I'm not saying that like ultra-Orthodoxy is perfect by any means. But if you don't understand these divides, it's very easy to go down the conspiratorial rabbit hole. It's like,
Hmm.
well, on one hand, these Jews are destroying the Middle East. Then you have fringes in the settler right in Israel who would like to expand Israel territorially even beyond the West Bank that don't have real representation. They have representation in government. They don't have elites that are down with those goals in Israel. And like the leftists in Europe are working to bring in the refugees all in concert to
But
like
it does look very convenient, you have to
yeah, yeah.
say.
Wait, what looks very convenient?
Well, to have all this Middle East war going on around there at the same time as these guys wanting to expand, at the same time as the US, the biggest, I think it's the biggest amount of aid goes to Israel. Like out of all
Oh,
all the 200 countries in the world, all of those ones with starving kids and everything, the most aid is going to Israel. So
so this is something I'd like to talk about. This is a very important thing. The the history of Israel, how it came to be the way it is, how it came to have its place in American foreign policy as it does, and why America gives so much aid to Israel. Now, the history of Israel is one where different elements from Europe came out, Jews from Europe. Many of them were Marxists, but most of the founders of Israel were leftists, and they wanted a more social democracy style country. They were Many of them were ruthless fighters, yes, but also many of them were absolutely horrified by the idea of kicking out natives. So I mean, there's disagreements between them. Some wanted to ethnically cleanse it from the start. Some people said, "No, you can't do that." And then you have this situation. Israel is founded. The leftists pretty much won. You have revisionist Zionism, which is frankly fascism. Jabotinsky, Yair Stern, and then it's very right wing, very independent minded. And the labor Zionists were much more willing to, let's say, cozy up to the West and say, we're going to be like you. We're going to have a liberal democracy in the West. And you see that very often in the language of modern Israeli talking points, like we're the only democracy in the Middle East. It's sort of a holdover in a very convenient way to market yourself. I think that needs to go. That mentality where we're Western and we're progressive. Like they say, Israel is so good because it gives Arabs the rights and it's the best place for LGBT people in the Middle East. And it's
yeah,
it's
I mean, but no one can dispute that they've like displaced a load of Palestinians.
No, absolutely not. In fact, I advocate, and I'm very open about this. I advocate for transferring the rest of the Palestinians. I think that,
Transferring? Please explain.
yeah,
Transferring what? How?
I think ethnic separation, where the West Bank has about 3 million Palestinians. I'd like to resettle them across the Jordan River or somewhere else in the Middle East. Uh, a lot of people were saying, no, 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 I don't want to do that, but we were going to keep them here. I hardline take the position where I think transfer is the proper course of action. So I don't have an issue saying that I support peaceful ethnic cleansing. But I just want to go back to
Said
this
that rather
history of Israel.
quietly. Sorry.
No, I support peaceful ethnic cleansing. Uh,
Right, okay, interesting. I see.
but
Because if I
the
said
the
that, I would be called a white supremacist. But I'm just saying. Okay.
no, I think you should support that. I think you should want to deport all the Muslims and Africans in Europe back to their host countries, but it's back to their home countries. I think whites should be able to say that. I have no problem with that. But I just want to go back to because we want to understand how this whole paradigm of aid and military assistance came to be. The labor Zionists won. Now you had this figure, and this was someone asked about this on Twitter. It was one of the questions posed. Do I know about Kahana? Of course I know about Kahana. He's seen as like the Jewish Hitler, and I don't agree with him on everything. I think he may have been too extreme on particular things. But he basically said, Jewish state is not compatible with liberal democracy. We have to move away from this mentality where we're progressive and Western. He's like, we have to understand that the Arabs in this part of the land are essentially a wartime enemy, and we should treat them as such. When two people war over a piece of land and one side wins, you drive out the other people. We're in this sort of limbo situation because of human rights and the international community, where if you say that, that's evil. If you say, no, we won this war, now you have to go, that's like settler colonialism. And a lot of Jews get into this whole thing. No, it's not settler colonialism. It's not like America. I mean, it isn't in many ways. It isn't like America. But this whole logic, they have to differentiate themselves between conquest of Europeans and their own conquest is because European conquest is evil, and they really do believe that at some level. Like the European conquest over America is illegitimate, and they're not willing to take their own side. And they say, no, we have to give the Palestinians their own chunk of land. And I say, no, we won the war. We go back. They just like any two nations fight a war over a piece of land, they drive the other nation out. And we should have finished the job when we had the chance in '67. I'm just very open about that. But you end up in the situation where I'll get to the aid because I do want to address that, but I have to give exposition. The labor Zionists, who represented a sort of establishment and really did want to be Western in some very meaningful sense, they wanted to be democratic and they wanted to follow. Even they knew that you can't just fully follow human rights within that conflict, but they did want to be Western. They were horrified. They literally banned Kahana for being racist. They made a law in the Israeli parliament.
What is Kahana, sorry? Oh, he's
Oh,
a guy. So
Yeah,
I
he's the
haven't heard about this guy. Sorry, he's the Jewish Hitler. You said.
yeah, but they call him that. I don't think that's a fair comparison.
Okay.
But
What did he do?
they
Like, why do people hate him?
he advocated for transfer, and he said that
Okay.
the Arabs have to go.
Right.
And you can't really say that in Israeli politics today. But think about it like this: the Middle Eastern mentality, Europe for a long time, for hundreds of years, was totally ensconced in ethnic and tribal conflict between Europeans, even like between these subgroups who were actually extremely related to each other and wanted to kill each other. And the Middle East, you have different Arab groups. They, after the two big world wars, Europeans sort of like, we're sick of war. We don't want to do this anymore. Let's have the EU. Let's nationalize our industries across borders because we just want to live peacefully. And then they let in all the Muslims. So, but they project the same mentality. A lot of white people project their own decision-making and conflict resolution mentality onto Middle Easterners, and that's a big problem. They're like, why can't you sit down and negotiate with them? Sometimes these people will not learn until you beat them back via a war, and
Yeah,
Khan
they have
understood
an
that.
85 IQ. Negotiations not really on the
It's
table.
it's not really just the IQ thing. It's also the mentality.
Yeah,
It's also
the
the
cultural way of doing
yeah,
things as well. Like, I know
yeah,
that it seems that, well, from stories I've heard of people in prison with them, it's like if you're nice, they'll walk all over you. So
yeah,
you've
yeah. It's the
just got
same
to
for
you've got to be kind of aggressive with them, otherwise they won't take you seriously. And obviously, that's not a European way of doing things. Really, we try to be nice to our neighbors.
people think that terrorism is caused by despair. It's actually quite the opposite. It's caused by a hope on top of that despair. If you actually just give people no hope, you'll see terrorism go away. If you're rough with them, if you kick them out of your countries, or if you're like, every time we do this, we're just going to and that's why I don't. There's this sort of false concern for Palestinians on the alt-right because they want to point out the double standards, which is legitimate, but on the other hand, they start using like leftist rhetoric, like what? It's like you guys should understand. You guys should probably want to do some of these things yourself. Maybe not, total military style occupation and more just deportation, but like they get on their moral high horse when really they should just be doing a lot of these things. But I get why they have that reaction. But anyway, back to the history. Kahana wanted to end aid. And he knew that America, which as it does now, is going to be very influential in the decision-making process, the internal politics of Israel. John Kerry said that, in the UN resolution before Obama left office. Right before the UN resolution, he said, we give Israel so much money that, why they don't listen to what we were saying on this issue. I'm like, then we don't want your money.
Yeah.
We
Why why
shouldn't
does
have.
the US care so much about Israel? Sorry, I just is this an oil thing? Like why does the US even want to be all over the Middle East?
So I will get to it. I just really want to finish this history thing because it's
Okay,
a
go on.
yeah, and yeah. Again, they wanted to continue the aid. They wanted this relationship with the West, and they banned Kahana because he was a threat to the status quo. And now you're in this situation where since you can't win a war anymore. How are we going to line the stars up in the region? How are we going to, let's say, deal with these other surrounding potential enemies rather than just project military might by beating your enemy back across the border? Well, we can't do that. So instead, it's been reduced. That why there are a number of reasons. Oh, definitely, I would not deny the Jewish influence aspect of it, but also a lot of the American foreign policy establishment, the non-Jewish establishment, has a very particular mentality when it comes to how they see geopolitics. They have a mentality of like, we are spreading democracy, even if they don't believe it can be done directly the way what it was and failed in Iraq. They really think that more nations embracing Western style consumer capitalism or some sort of liberal ideals is better. And I think they don't. It's part of the problem with white people where they project how they do things onto everyone else. And honestly, some of these people don't want to do things that way, and
Yeah.
they struggle with that concept. And this Israel is this liberal. I mean, considering, despite everything that's going on, many of these Gentile neocons do sincerely believe in projecting American power, and they see Israel as like this staging ground or a way to have an in the Middle East. And part of it is also like this sentimental connection for much of the establishment, where it's like, oh, we've been allies for them for so long. I've actually told like non-Jewish Christians that I just support ending aid to Israel and ending military intervention. I don't want to bomb Iran. And when I say that, they actually get like, what do you mean? How could you say that? Like, we've been there for you this whole time. Now you want to cut us off? Like that, I've gotten some of them angry at me, even saying that I think Israel should just sort of divorce from the U.S. I
Yeah.
think that they disentangle. But
Yeah.
a lot of them, you see like these evangelicals lobbying for war in Iran. Or why are they doing that? They really think this is, the proper foreign policy, and how to. And
I think it's kind of like when things get too easy for for a group of people, they kind of just disintegrate, and it's like they need to have some war to be fighting, even if it's elsewhere, for their team. You know.
yeah, it's a lot of it is vicarious nationalism. Like white people don't
Yeah.
have their own nationalism.
Right.
Uh, what's ironic is on the left, you see the Palestinians are like a core target of this vicarious nationalism because whites don't have in-group solidarity. So like
Hmm.
we're going to stand up for the Palestinians. On the right in America, it's more like the Israelis. Yeah, like that's how they express the nationalism that they don't feel comfortable expressing for themselves.
Right.
So certainly it's a substitute for something that they're missing. Yeah, it becomes part of their identity, and I think some of the neocon rhetoric is aimed at creating that sort of emotional bond. But I want to get to a point, and this is one thing I really like uh, about the alt-right. Richard Spencer wrote a piece, and he also is like, oh, he's a Zionist plant and all that. He wrote a piece called "An Alliance with the Jews," but it's not really an alliance. Like the language that these neocons use, like Israel is an ally of the West against extremism, which I think is a ridiculous concept the way it's applied, because the more sometimes you have the Saudis funding sectarian terrorists, and Israel kind of just like looks back. Like they look the other way because it's not something that it does sort of benefit them in this on the side, and meanwhile they're like, we're gonna. It's one thing if they wanted to like eradicate ISIS, if Israel and the Saudis were going to go in together and just destroy these terrorist groups. That's not really what's happening at all. And meanwhile, Europe is taking in immigrants. So the neocon narrative, like Europe should just close its borders first. That's the
Yeah.
first way to fight Islam on the part of Europe.
Hmm.
Anyway, back to Richard Spencer. He was saying that a lot of these Jews in the far right in Israel don't actually want American intervention. Much of the settler right is very anti-American in the sense that every time they want to build a new settlement or they want to annex territory or they want to do something, to make some move in the West Bank, all they hear is America saying, no, hold on, you can't do that. Even Trump made statements, even Bush made these statements, even like the more pro-Israel presidents made these statements. And they're like, why do we need this? What? And the aid, by the way, $3.8 billion a year as per the most recent agreement. First of all, we don't need that money. I know a lot of people they're like, oh, if America wasn't support. First of all, the military budget is $15 billion a year. That's just the military budget. That's not anything else. And one of the big reasons we have such a military budget is because of this perpetual occupation, where if you have to station troops on the ground to deal with a hostile population, then that costs money. If you have to have missile defense systems in place to deal with the constant threat of that costs money. All these things are very expensive to upkeep. So if the situation were allowed to, just it ended, this would not be an expense. And on top of that, I'll go even further. A lot of your readers might not believe me, but I think aid actually hurts Israel economically, and I'll explain why that is. Israel is 10th in the world as an arms supplier. We have an extremely large arms industry for the size of our country. And American arms industry, they're just looking out for their own interests, the military-industrial complex, all these arms contractors. For them, 70-something% of that aid, it's in the agreement, it's officially in the agreement, has to be spent on American arms and American military equipment. And you end up with a situation where instead of buying our own domestic products,
Mm.
instead of allowing our own military industry, our own arms industry to flourish, and that also pays dividends in employment and R&D in growing the economic sector, which is worth much more than $3.8 billion dollars, in the long term, or even $38 billion dollars, and actually keeps R&D down because these countries are not investing in continual betterment of our own equipment. Over time, it creates dependence, it creates stagnation, and even mainstream Israeli economists actually support ending aid. Even some of the far-right politicians, like Moshe Feiglin, he's in one of the right-wing parties. Even he supports ending aid. A lot of the settler right, who are the most hardcore right-wing nationalist elements in Israel, have said we want American aid should end. This goes back to Kahana, because it's if you want independence, we have a sort of dynamic with America where even though we don't listen to everything they say, we're a colony of them of sorts. We have to listen to a lot of the declarations they make. We're beholden to their actions, their seals of approval. That dependence is something that needs to go away. And aid is part of the reason that dependence is where it is. So I would support ending AIDS for even selfish reasons, but on top of that, I think that a lot of Americans would support that, and I have no problem with it. So that's why we are. I hope that's a decent history. It's a very broad picture thing. You have to go into like the Israel refuses to, it's also part of the way we wage wars today, where we don't wage war. We don't actually win wars. We can't go in and drive a population back. So that plays into, okay, well then how are you going to deal with your regional enemies? So you have to do this maneuvering where you get the United States to apply either force, diplomatic pressure. So that's why the dynamic was created the way it is. But also some of the way the alt-right talks about these wars, you would think that Israel doesn't fight its own wars against direct enemies. That's just plainly not true. The majority of the wars in Israeli history involved no American troops on front lines. I mean, all Israeli wars, actually. Like the Iraq War, even though it ends up being in the interests of Israel in many regards, it wasn't the fighting of a direct enemy. And just a distinction that people should make when talking about this topic. But the 48 War, the 67 War, the 73 War, goes down the list, were all wars that we fought on our own. With American intelligence help, of course, but...
Right, okay. So we've just about come to the end of this show, and I just wanted to ask you perhaps to kind of sum up your points before we end.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I think that nationalists very often can find common ground in a way that non-nationalists cannot. Like these Black Lives Matter people, they're identitarians, certainly, but their whole thing is, getting more and more influence or more laxation of certain rules in society to benefit their own interests as minorities in a host society. It only goes so far, and it also comes at an expense to the host population. I think that a lot of Jews, similarly, it's a different dynamic. They want to just continually. The only way you can essentially continue to coexist in a diaspora, a lot of the tactic they do use is victimhood. They play to the sympathy of the host population. That works as long as everyone is well fed. It works as long as there's no economic collapses. It works when people actually still feel some sense of control over their country. All that goes. That sort of sense of security in the diaspora will go, and that's the way you prevent another Holocaust is not like people that I want to touch upon this point. I do think the Holocaust happened, certainly, but they don't realize what Weimar was like before. With these Jews were very honestly pushing this. It wasn't mass immigration, but they were in academia. They were the communists. Hitler saw what they did in Russia. He was worried about what they were going to do in Germany. It doesn't necessarily justify all these actions. The majority of Jews who suffered and died were, let's say, innocent laborers or shopkeepers. But that kind of cycle, if you don't understand at least that you can't play victim forever, because people observe certain things, and that's something that you can't. The solution is to have your own country. I often joke, although it's not really a joke, if Hitler had deported Jews into Israel, if he expelled all of them, even if he confiscated their property, which was an agreement that Yair Stern, the Lehi, wanted with him, but it didn't work out. There was a small transfer, and then it fell apart. I would be looking back at National Socialism, the actual historical, as almost something positive, where it's sort of you had this host nation that expelled the Jews. But separation is a much healthier course of action for many of these nations, and and independence. I think both of us would support that for even just our own interests. So I believe in, different nation states where we can pursue our own destiny and others can pursue theirs. Obviously, reality is more complicated than that, but that's just a basic universal idea there. And then on top of that, I would say that I'm willing to come to the table and sort of talk about these issues honestly and seriously. And a lot of Jews are shy, or they think that talking about these things is scary or it's uncomfortable. I think that we should start talking about these things more and seriously preparing for the end of the diaspora, which is something that I support.
Great.
Are there any other questions that you have?
Oh, I was going to leave it there because I think we've run out of time. But just let everyone know where they can find more from you, please.
TheJewishAlternative.com. That's one word, no hyphens. Or you can follow me at Reactionary Jew on Twitter. It's one word, no hyphens or anything like that. Feel free to hit me up there. I'm pretty responsive. You can even send me a DM if you want. And my email for these purposes is reactionaryjew at gmail.com. Also one word, no hyphens, spaces, dots, nothing. Yeah. And have a good day. And thank you very much for having me on. And I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. This was definitely a great podcast. So thanks for coming on and sharing your views and everything. I'm going to just ask the audience, please, to like this video, share it, and subscribe on YouTube or on iTunes, wherever you're listening. And I'll see you guys in the next Reality Calls show. Thanks again, Reactionary Jew.